Monday Night Live in Lexington, you guys. We're just going to go over a couple of things while everybody's getting their notifications on. If you guys hadn't already noticed on my Facebook page, my napping show that was on Thursday nights has been moved to tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So what that does is it gives people on the West Coast a better view of my broadcasts, and I don't have to stay up as late, so that's a plus as well. So let's see who's getting on. Hey to Loretta, Ricky, Melissa, Paige, John, and Sean. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is our special guest, Shifu Careaga, and we are going over tonight is the Earth in Upheaval, or you can call it the cosmos in upheaval, or the world in upheaval.
We're talking about the end of the world.
Yes.
Talking about Ragnarok.
So, tell us what we're going to delve into tonight.
I thought what we'd do is we review Velikovsky's Conundrum, which is the episode, I think that was our third episode.
It was the third one.
And talk about a little bit about Houghton Arp. And I want to kind of frame in context. There's a lot changing in science right now between dark matter going under and them switching to more electric model every day. These astronomers are waking up. So remember that Velikovsky, this is like 1950, his book comes out. It's this book here, you can get it. And
Immanuel Velikovsky.
He was a disciple of a student of Freud. He was a friend of Albert Einstein. The most important thing about this, the conundrum, is that he made all these predictions, whereas the standard model makes almost no predictions. In fact, it routinely fails at predictions. Like I say,
it does.
Uranus cannot form at this distance, and it must have moved out, but then they run the computer model and they can't do it. So accretion model has basically officially failed, and it keeps failing, whereas Immanuel Velikovsky is just using testimony of ancient people, quotes I'm going to go over from out of this book. He predicts a number of things scientifically, predicts that Venus will be hot, that it's rotating retrograde, it's slowing down, that Jupiter has radio waves, the moon has water, that Mars has water. He predicted that Venus's atmosphere had what is it? Not the carbohydrates, the hydrocarbons, based on just the stories from the Bible of the manna falling. So he makes all these predictions. They turn out true. Rather than giving him a Nobel Prize, they ostracize him because he happened to make enemies with the head of Harvard astronomy, who happened to be a guy who had an axe.
His theorems were going against the scientific model.
They were at that time, and this is pre-space era. Now, once the space age happens, they go back and there's a Velikovsky revisited. And it turns out like a lot of things that he said were true. So they had a big debate. Of course, then Carl Sagan steps in to defend big science, and it was a total sham. It was a sideshow. There's a whole PhD dissertation that dismantles Carl Sagan. So now we're left here wondering, well, who do we listen to? Do we listen to the ancients, which would be Graham Hancock argues in Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, that there's ancient testimony. Do we listen to them? Or do we listen to the mainstream science? And my argument coming from mainstream science is, I can tell you there's not a lot of great predictions and models in mainstream science. It's failing left and right.
Well, they just had their Rosetta. Their theorems are falling apart.
The theorems are falling apart.
Substantiated by anything.
Right. There's a lot of his guesswork. Like the Oort cloud was, named after a man named Oort, and he said there would be these dirty snowballs, but then Rosetta gets there, and just the other day, just like the week before last, a chunk of rock blows off. They see the jet. There's no water underneath. It's just rock. So they need to know what actually happened. Now, today, the subject is comparative mythology. How do we see this story reflected in these different cultures, like comparing Norse and Greek and Egyptian, etc.? So we're going to get there. As far as ARP is concerned, I want people to understand that the entirety of Big Bang cosmology is predicated on redshift being about distance. What Houghton Arp proved with his books, Seeing Red is one of them, and he has PhDs. He has 300 galaxies named after him. What he proved is that redshift was an intrinsic property of matter. And then it's not only about distance, but it's also about age, which makes sense. If there's space and there's time, you know, redshift could be about either one.
So though there's a lot of people that are tuning in tonight that don't know what ARP and the redshift is. So if you could just kind of
real briefly, what Houghton Arp saw when he looked through the telescopes when he was at Los Alamos, he saw a galaxy mother and a quasar baby, and they were connected by a string of plasma. And that connection was ignored by a lot of the mainstream astronomers. They didn't want to believe what they were seeing out of the equipment. And of course, this is radio X-ray. This is not, you know, a line of sight. This is radio X-ray and gamma ray emissions. And it's sort of like we have in the Milky Way, we have these big bubbles that come out. They're like light bulbs. Here's the thing that doesn't make sense about them. The most energetic interactions are happening furthest away from the center, which doesn't make sense in thermodynamics, at least explosive thermodynamics. In explosive thermodynamics.
Yes.
In electric plasma cosmology, it makes perfect sense because it's just like a light bulb. It's just like a fluorescent bulb. So it's no problem for the tops of these bulbs to light up.
Right.
Well, he in his dissertation, he goes through and he proves the intrinsic redshift. He gives all the information, the calculations, everything. They still ostracize him. He goes to Europe instead of practice. They wouldn't give him telescope time. So he's like a literal modern day Galileo. The two of them are modern day Galileos of the 20th century. They're both passed on.
You know, are we just destined to repeat stuff?
Well, that would be the Ragnarok assumption. You know? I have a theory that you know, it's not about how many Buddhas are sent and how many saviors and angels. Every generation has to deal with its delusions and then learn. And if we don't deal with dukkha right around us, you'll end up with more flat earth, etc. It's a real problem.
Let's check and make sure there aren't any questions. For those of you that are tuned into my professional page, Kathryn Kauffman, Psychic Medium, or on Instagram, I want to say special hi to Instagram over here. I won't be able to answer your questions on Instagram or the professional page. The main page that I have pulled up is my personal page here, so let me check for questions. I want to say a shout out to Joy Barger and Joy Johnson and Stormy. Hey to Scott Harden and Joanne Sewell and Santa Cruz. Floriana, hey, thanks for tuning in, and Pamela Thompson. Jean McKee and Kim's Garden Works. Awesome to see you. And my good buddy, Sandra Buchanan Clemens. And a special shout out, much love to Wes Ruiz. You are powerful. So let's get started on this Velikovsky conundrum.
Right. So the solar system.
That's a big place.
They honestly don't know how it was started. They've made a lot of predictions, but here's what it's coming.
I don't know that we'll ever know.
Maybe, and a lot that's probably true because if there was an Atlantis and they would have been full of astronomers, just as Sumer was, it's obviously gone. It's sunk into the sea. We won't have access to their scrolls, even if they were clay tablets, probably turned to rubble. It'd be very difficult for us to dig up Lemuria and the continent of Mauritius and Beringia and Indonesia. You know, I doubt we're going to open Gunung Padang and find a perfect record of the solar system. However, certain cultures, the ones especially that talk about 7 suns versus only 5 or 3, are the ones that are old enough and mature enough to keep that. And in particular, I like the Sumerian and Egyptian, the Greek and the Nordic. And I really like the Nordic because by using family lineages, they basically record the changes in the planets and how they behaved. So for example, Loki is not actually the son of Odin. And in the beginning of Loki's, like early on, Loki could be either male or female. And this perfectly matches the descriptions from Sumer and Greece of Venus, which in the beginning was revered as male because of the horns, which is plasma discharge, and the beard. And then becomes female as it passed by and this white stuff was coming down, the ambrosia or the honeydew, and it's coming down, so they thought of it as not a bull but a cow. And so sometimes Athena is actually pictured as a bearded woman,
bearded woman
with horns.
With horns.
So now, when Venus then moves closer to Earth, becomes larger, that's when Loki begets Hel. And Hel, this goddess of death, with all the tendrils and the snakes, of course, it's the Medusa, attacking Earth. And that gives room for Mars or Thor to come in and save mankind, which then later he has a warrior lust and, quote, betrays us again. The scar-faced tyrant passes closer to the Earth in about the 600s to 700s BC and lays destruction to Middle Eastern cities. For some reason, the Middle East seems to get a more vast number of this, but it still happened it happened in Lake Titicaca, it happened in Mexico and North America. Obviously, there were major ones. So here's what I'd like to talk about. Of the 7 suns, let's talk about 3 of the cataclysms. Okay. Now we're in the 7th sun, so it eliminates 1 already. The first cataclysm I'd like to talk about is some object passed close to us at the Younger Dryas period. Certain South American tribes, you can read this in...
Do you think it was a comet?
No, I think it was the moon.
The moon.
I think it was the moon. Based on Sumerian record, the story of Tiamat and the death of her lover, the moon was... Our previous moon was destroyed and became the asteroid belt. And there are 2 large masses that go around in the asteroid belt, so it could have actually happened in 2 pieces. Hard to know.
Yeah.
And at that time, Marduk comes and slays the lover and then splits open Tiamat's head. So something passed really close to us. We don't know for sure, but the way that the moon keeps facing us and the way it's excavated on one side electrically, you can tell when you zoom into a really high depth, like a 4 gig image, you can see the same type of cratering, perpendicular cratering that we see in the northern hemisphere of Mars. So this repeated thing. And I think that the moon and Mars and Earth all came from a Saturnian system together, that we were all in one system. And then there was a bit of transfer back and forth with Jupiter. But at some point, Earth was thought to have wandered too close or fallen out of favor with this Jupiter or Zeus character. And then it was sent, and Enlil sent Marduk, and it basically passed really close to us. And that basically ended the Ice Age. A lot of animals went extinct. Of course, my theory being via mostly step potential, but clearly, I mean, massive waves, mountains coming up, and also places being laid low. You had the Gobi Desert in China was apparently tipped upward. And that's why when you look at the Talikman Desert, it's like, it looks like a seabed, because it was actually a large inland sea, and there were these inundating waters that China's history that they had to deal with. Lake Titicaca is currently also slanted, so we know that the South American plate was lifted at a certain angle, so you can measure that.
That's an enormous force.
It is, well, and the electric force is an enormous force. It's because it's 10 to the 38 times stronger than gravity. So it wouldn't have to pass too close to cause these kinds of problems. Perhaps as close as maybe a quarter the distance that it currently is. And I think a pass or 2 before it enters in an orbit. And the way that it faces us currently, I still think there's an electrical attraction between the 2.
Well, just the distance between the Earth and the moon, and the way the moon reacts on the tides. I mean,
right now,
you can understand how that would alter the landscape.
Right, and it's an important thing that I brought this diagram of the drop in electricity. Now, the Birkeland currents, I discussed these before, are way more efficient, they're this top one, than the electricity in the magnet. But now when you get in really close, and that's especially indicated up here, the Birkeland currents are weak, but the electric field and the magnetic are really, really powerful. And they exceed. And so when you have a force that strong, when they get closer, it's going to actually multiply fast. In fact, the electric field goes by the inverse of the cube. And so if it's 3 times closer, it's actually going to be 27 times stronger.
Yes.
And the magnetic field is going to be square, so it's going to be a lot stronger. And the closer it gets, now they were repelled by each other for the same reason. Once there's an electric discharge, the Thunderbirds, or you could say Zeus's thunderbolt, the Vajra of Shiva. Once these things happen, then there's a repulsion. And that repulsion then kicks it out, but it doesn't go forever away because there's still an attraction between the 2, just like inside the atom, the proton and the electron.
So there are, again, I'm going to do a couple shout outs, but I want you, while I'm doing that, I want you to explain because I know that there are a few people that don't know what a Birkeland current is.
Okay. Well, go ahead and do your shout outs.
Okay, so hi to Jay Ross, Paige, Wayne, and a special shout out to Arwen Careaga and the kids. Hey to all the kids there. Rolando and Jen and Angie, Ethel, Larry Lamb, Jennifer Hickerson, Janet, Kyle, Yasmin Jadoon, and Danny Dugan Marshall. Kisses to you. Miss you so much.
Hi, guys.
And Mitchell Cully. So let's go ahead with Birkeland.
Well, a Birkeland current is basically a special way that electricity over long distances wraps itself around, especially in the form of plasma current, and it twists around, and there's a counter rotation. And when you have counter rotation, say from the north to the south pole on the Earth, when you have the counter rotation of the auroras, you have a couple things happening. One, you have a difference in potential between the north and south pole, so you have capacitance. And another thing is you have twisting, coiling electricity, so you have magnetic field generation. So it's not just created by the iron in the Earth, folks. It's not about an iron core.
Right.
It's being generated by an inductor. And actually, there's a transformer going on there, because you have different numbers of coils of different sizes. So the Earth and Jupiter and Saturn form an electric circuit where there's inductance, capacitance, resistance, of course, because you have basically the antithesis of conductivity going on. And now there's transforming of the sun's energy, and then they're interacting with each other too. So it's so complex, we really can't even model it with supercomputers. You can take all the world's supercomputers, it's not going to be able to do it very quickly.
So when you, I think we went over that in like the first episode.
Yeah,
where you brought the
plasma ball.
The plasma ball.
Yeah, those are simple, although occasionally you can see a small twist, but it's very hard to see them because they move so fast.
Right. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, or you want to see the example of it, go back and look at the first episode.
And then the last episode we talked about.
Right, and I will leave those links in the comments for you.
So we have this solar system that is clearly at least bipolar. You could say even tripolar if you add Pluto and everything else past Pluto and all the rocky planetoids that inhabit the outer solar system. But you have this inner rocky stuff, and you have these large gas giants that have an inordinate amount of rocky but very diverse material going around them. That's our pantheon. That's our Asirs and our Vannirs. Okay, so the Asirs being the main gods, and then the Vanir being the subservient gods. It's the same thing in the Greek mythology too. You have first you have your Titans, which are they're the planets in the early stage. And what we have to understand is why it's called suns. They're not just epochs, but the actual, like Saturn and Jupiter, before even the sun came along, they were exchanging energy back and forth. And there's several of the cataclysms between the Younger Dryas and the Venus cataclysm where we don't even know exactly what happened, but we know that there were more Ragnaroks. Right. Because there were different types of Ragnarok. There was a hurricane Ragnarok, there was a wind Ragnarok, there was mountains coming up Ragnarok. So we don't know which moons may have passed close to us. Clearly, at some point, Kronos being Saturn, ate its child, maybe ate multiple children. Something crashed into Jupiter, apparently, that created Venus. We don't know what object it was. Maybe it was the sister of the three major deities, being, of course, Poseidon and Uranus and Zeus. So at some point, those major gas planets have interacted with each other. The Uranus and Neptune became less, and they were subservient, so they're considered far away. One representing the underworld, one representing the icy world, probably Uranus and then Neptune in order. And then you had Saturn and Jupiter being the first Odin and Thor, and then later on Jupiter becomes Odin and Mars becomes Thor.
It's amazing how all the correlations are between Greek and Roman mythology.
And the Greek, they kept it simple. Kronos, then Zeus, then Apollo.
That's why I like Greek mythology better.
Well, and then you have Ares, and Apollo is separate, of course, Apollo and Aphrodite representing the sun and the moon. Now, it says in the mythologies that Apollo grew like a baby, which means that at some point soul came into us. And apparently at that time, we were in sort of we were inside the plasma sheath of either Jupiter or Saturn. And it just depends on who you talk to, what mythologies that they trust. And then we were pulled out of that, and so was Venus, Mercury, and Mars. And
what
so,
does Velikovsky say about that?
He thinks that we were in the Jupiter orbit because that Zeus was our current god at that time, and then we were pulled out of that. We know that at some point, Ra, the first Ra, becomes is thrown away from the system and recedes into the background. That's Saturn going far away. It's really quite far away from us now.
Yes, it is.
And so, how did they know about the rings? They had to have seen it.
They had to.
They had to, and they could see Uranus was tilted on its side, like hung up on by its heels.
And they had to have seen that.
Yeah, they had to have seen that. So at some point, that's removed away, and we are taken inward, and then there's an exchange of energy. And now in Exodus, there's a plague of darkness. So it's possible that when the sun came in, it actually pulled a lot of energy from the Jupiter, turning that brown dwarf on. The energy is transferred to Sol, to the sun, and the sun becoming then brighter and becoming a yellow star, and then it, of course, expanding in its size. Now, all of them, they have about the same, like Saturn's magnetosphere, Jupiter's magnetosphere are like nearly the size of the sun. So if you were far, far away, they would actually look like brown dwarf stars.
Yes.
They would be very dim brown dwarf stars now, but apparently at the time, they used to be a lot brighter, not necessarily bright though. So when they were in the sky and they were large, they weren't overwhelming. They were actually, other than occasionally eating their children and mating with their sisters and destroying everything, and occasionally there being cosmic thunderbolts. Other than that, apparently life was pretty good. It's just that once the Atlantean event happens, and things start to be destroyed worldwide, especially at the Younger Dryas event, when you have the first deluge, then you have a series of Ragnaroks, and then you come to the Venus Ragnarok, which became the most important one for us, because that's when the great flood of the Bible is recounted.
Exactly.
But it's really from Sumeria.
You make sure there's no questions here.
Yeah, sure.
Hey to Greta, Patricia, Ryan, Staten, Ellie, Tim, and Julie Chi. Thanks for joining us tonight. If you guys have any questions at all, please put them in the comment section. We'll be glad to get back to you on an answer as soon as we can. Even if it's after the episode and you think of something you want to ask, just put it in there.
So I brought some of the quotations from Worlds in Collision, some of the ones that I really liked here.
So Worlds in Collision was written by
Emmanuel
Velikovsky, and these are quotes taken from that particular manuscript.
So it says how the Greeks had similar traditions. There's a period wrote Censorinus called the Supreme Year by Aristotle, in which the sun, moon, and all the planets return to their original position. This year's great winter called Cataclysmos, which means deluge, and a great summer called Epikrios, or the conflagration of the world. The world actually seems to be inundated and then uninundated alternately in each of these epochs. This is due to the forces of ever-active fire, which exists in things in the course of long cycles of time that resolves around itself, and the world is born. In one such catastrophe, the world will meet its ultimate destruction, creating a new world. It will fall apart into atoms, out of which, after a long process, a new Earth will be created somewhere in the universe.
And these are his predictions.
Well, no, these are, so there's citations at the bottom of these are things that he makes only conclusions from works, and he'll actually present anti-conclusions from other people, who don't believe in. And then but there's citations for everything in the bottom of every page has citations in the book.
Okay.
And you have the Codices of Mexico, in which multiple authors composing annals of the past gave prominent place to a tradition of world catastrophes that decimated humankind and changed the face of the earth. The Chinese call these ages keys, number 10 keys from the beginning of the world until Confucius. In the ancient Chinese encyclopedia, general convulsions of nature are discussed because the periodicity of these convulsions, a span of time between two catastrophes, is regarded as a great year. And as during a year, so during the world age, the cosmic mechanism winds itself up in a general convulsion of nature. The sea is carried out of its bed, mountains spring out of the ground, rivers change their course, human beings and everything are ruined, and ancient traces are effaced. So therefore, that's why we can't find anything about Atlantis.
Because it's been destroyed.
And the same thing with the Great Pyramid. Why can't we find the tools that it was made with? Probably because not just one flood happened, probably because there's at least two, if not more. If these things go back 24,000 years, which is possible with like the great, the Bosnian pyramid, the Nung Padang, if it's possible that it goes back 12 to 24,000 years, or as some people believe in 36,000 years, going to a previous age of Leo, not the last age of Leo, but the previous age, then every time that there's one of these great events, things are changed. And we change too. We become inspired by swords in the sky and spears, and apparently there were giant bats. So there's all sorts of kinds of things that we...
creepy.
Well, in our obsession with bats, there's also stories, and it's covered really quite well in Fingerprints of the Gods, the story of the great wolf in the sky, Fenrir. So talking about this, apparently worldwide. It's not Nordic only.
No, that's what makes it more credible.
That's right, exactly.
It's worldwide.
The Mayas counted their ages by the names of the consecutive suns. These were called the water sun, the earthquake sun, the hurricane sun, and the fire sun. These suns mark the epochs which are attributed to various catastrophes the world has suffered. A native Indian scholar, I can't say that name, I'm sorry, in his annal, it's got a lot of X's and C's.
Oh, okay.
Kings of Tezuko described the world ages by the name of suns. The water sun was the first age, terminated by a deluge in which almost all creatures perished. The earthquake sun, an age, perished in a terrific earthquake, and the earth broke into many pieces. So there's the Tiamat event. And then there was a hurricane sun, and there's videos about mountains, and you can find this in the EU primer, where there are certain mountains that are too triangular and too repeated. So it shows that great winds were constantly beating upon that mountain, layering triangular force, and it's mathematical. It's not a matter of what weather erosion. It's a matter of something was moving in, right, but it was moving in a way that was layering it in a resonant wave. So this is really fascinating. These giant winds,
almost like
it's kind of hard to imagine.
EMP.
Like imagine a nuclear force blast, but a continuous one.
Yeah, continuously.
And a lot of these were described in Exodus too. A lot of these ones. Let's see here. This quote is, I forget which culture this is here. Jub-Mel, the heaven lord himself, came down. His terrible anger flashed like red, blue, and green fire serpents. People hid their faces, and the children screamed with fear. And the angry God spoke, I shall reverse the world. I shall bid the rivers flow upward. I shall cause the sea to gather together itself into a huge towering wall, which I shall hurl upon your wicked earth children and thus destroy them in all life.
Wow.
And it's a tendency among all the cultures, including Native American cultures, to see it as about something somebody else did. In fact, while I remember to, I'll read this quote. This is from Ice Age, In Search of Ice Age Americans. This is the Delaware, them talking to Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, who often is referred to as the father of American archaeology, was fascinated with the Macedons and the Ice Age Americans.
Wow.
Jefferson was convinced that people lived in the Americas at the same time the Macedons were living at Big Bone Lick. His reasoning was based on part of the oral tradition of the Delaware Indians, which he had recorded firsthand. During the American Revolutions, Jefferson met with a group of Delaware warriors and asked them what happened to the great animals whose bones are found at the Salt Lakes of the Ohio.
Oh, interesting.
A chief, which means this is the best orator in the group who's going to have the most lore. And the group stood up and said, in ancient times, a herd of these tremendous animals came to the Big Bone Licks and began a universal destruction of the bear, deer, elk, buffaloes, and other animals which had been created for the use of the Indians.
Oh.
That the great man above, or your Thor, looking down and seeing this, was so enraged that he seized his lightning, descended on the earth, seated himself on a neighboring mountain, on the rock which his feet and the print of his foot, and hurled the bolts among them till the whole were slaughtered, except the big bolt, who, presenting his forehead to the shaft, shook them off as they fell. Missing one at length, it wounded him in the side, whereon he sprang round, bounded over the Ohio, over the Wabash, the Illinois, finally over the Great Lakes, where he's living to this day.
Wow.
So there you go. That's what mostly what
that's interesting,
what my
because that brings it closer to our age.
That's right, and and so we don't know this great man. This is probably the Mars event. But it could have been. This story could go all the way back to either the Venus event or even before that. It sounds like it goes back to the Younger Dryas event.
Yes.
So we don't know because we haven't done the research. We do know that there were impact craters. Most of these impact craters, however, do not match. Like Jephthah Knob here in Kentucky is an oblique strike. It doesn't match that, most of them. Most of them are like perpendicular or oval shaped. We're researching it. Not everybody agrees, obviously. Even the alternate, I don't even agree with the comet alternate theory, because it's clear that we didn't Native Americans did not kill all the mastodons.
No.
But not everybody agrees as to what was that alternate. So here's a good one. According to the Lapland epic, the world was overwhelmed by a hurricane and sea. Almost all human beings perished. After the seawall fell on the continent, that must have been something to see. The gigantic waves continued to roll, and dead bodies were dashed about in the dark waters.
Jeez.
The great earthquake and chasms that opened on the ground, the appearance of a celestial body with serpent-like flashes. So that's hell, or Medusa. Rivers flowing upwards, seawall crushed everything. Mountains became leveled or covered with water. The world that was turned over was tilted, and the sun that shone no more in the sky. And all these motifs are found in descriptions and calamities of the time of Exodus. Again, some rabbinical sources saying that up to 9 out of 10 Hebrews died just in the plague of darkness by itself, because for 9 days they didn't have any light, so they couldn't see food, they couldn't see water.
Right.
And then a good number, maybe even up to half, died still. They were in the Red Sea when there was apparently a thunderbolt crash somewhere in that area. And when that happened, it equalized. And you can see that in the video that was released today by Ben.
Yes.
There's a moment where the water is under electric field, and a little spark goes down, and the water gets still for a moment before resuming its rippling. Because when the electricity is discharged, and there's equilibrium is reached.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Let's see here. The words of a priest were only an introduction to a revelation of his knowledge. This is talking about Phaethon. And an Egyptian priest explained to Solon that in the catastrophes, the literary works of many peoples of their learned men perished. For this reason, the Greeks were still childish, as they no longer knew the true horrors of the past. The words of the priest were only an introduction to the revelation of his knowledge about lands that were erased when Greece also and the entire world were visited by heavenly wrath. He's told the story of a mighty kingdom on a great island in the middle of the ocean that was submerged and sank into the waters. Thence comes the Atlantic. So now you know about Atlantis. It's not just an isolated myth. It is actually related to these earth and upheaval.
Let's check
Go
the
ahead.
questions. So Armin says, cool video, Dad. Love Armin. Hey to Rachel, Betty Jo, James, and Doug, and Judy Burkett Roberts, and Kimberly Bruce, and Jonathan Holt. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Sandra Lanham. No questions that I can see here. And thanks for watching Instagram. Hey to Gidge and Parachad and Sunil Agarwal. Thanks for joining. Hey to Sunil. You missed Keeneland this year, fall meet. So see you in April.
There were some more that was like the Wichita Indians and different groups. So the book is chock full of different tribes, different.
But there's a lot of all the verbal recounts are similar.
Right. And now here's an interesting thing that interested me. Venus was employed in the calendars of the Old and New World alike, and this makes sense because they were obsessed afterwards with the comets. They were deadly afraid. In fact, in China, if the astrologer failed to predict a comet or an eclipse, off with his head. That was it. Yeah. And some of the kings, even in Sumeria, same thing. So what they would do is they would install a fake king. He'd live it up, and then they would sacrifice that king to Venus. Of course, the Great Serpent Mound. We went over this in the first or second episode.
There.
Right. So Venus was employed in the calendars. The synodical years of Venus equal 2,920 days, whereas 8 years of 365 is 22,920. And so after 8 years, you end up with these two calculations coming together. In other words, in 4 years, there's a difference of only 1 day between the Venus and the Julian calendars.
Wow.
So here we thought that originally they were making it to do with the sun, and that's not why they switched from the lunar calendar. They switched in our culture. Now the Mayans, they were just trying to be really precise because they thought they could be precise. They could predict Ragnarok.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
which they didn't call it Ragnarok, but it was the same tenet, and it was thousands of miles different. And it's possible that these continents that people crossed, but I highly doubt that the entire culture was based. Now we do know that Quetzalcoatl is, of course, described as being a white man. Did he come from the Nordic place, and did he bring that information, or did he come from Sumeria?
A lot of questions.
No ideas. No ideas. There are a lot of these questions, and it's one of those things where I think that the research is still open to more interpretation. I don't think anybody has the 100% answer on this.
I don't think they're going to. I think we're just going
Probably
to
not.
evolve into finding out a little bit more and kind of collecting data and putting it together.
I thought this was interesting. There's a section on, and I immediately thought of Loki's trickiness, about Venus would sometimes disappear for long periods of time and then appear, sometimes twice within 2 weeks, and then disappear for long periods of time. So the elliptical orbit was highly elliptical, and then later on after our discharge became rounded into more circular, which now the sun is slowly slowing Venus back down so that it can correct its motion. So I find that really fascinating too. Let's see if there's anything else here. Yeah, here's an interesting one. Herodotus did not travel to the south of Egypt. Thus, he did not see the statue or he must have. He had seen the statue in Letopolis. Even today, many bronze mice, sometimes inscribed with the prayers of pilgrims, are found in the ground of Letopolis. Both cities, with the cult of the sacred mouse, are called the sacred cities of the Thunderbolts and Meteorites. The Egyptian name of Letopolis is indicated by the same hieroglyphic as Thunderbolt.
So,
there you
if
go.
Any of you guys are just
hieroglyphics.
joining us, I would suggest going to watch the Thunderbolts project on YouTube.
The Thunderbolts of the Gods. I mean, if you're very skeptical and you want to know more about watch the lightning-scarred planet, which is Mars, and that's the, I guess, Symbols of an Alien Sky, part 2. Then, of course, you can watch Symbols of an Alien Sky and Thunderbolts of the Gods and Remembering the End of the World. They're pretty mind-bending.
Yeah,
but if an EE guy who came up and was quite atheist, and now granted I do acupuncture now, but if I can come up that way and bend my mind, and here's what I never approached Big Bang as a religion. A lot of people do.
I never did either.
It's very difficult. I actually helped a friend. He's very Jewish. He studies Kabbalah, and I love the guy, but he had a real hard time, and so we were discussing black holes, and he said, but they found one, and he posted me a picture. I said, Ruben, that's a CG. And he was like, well, I can't find the original. I said, well, let me go look it up. So I looked it up, and then I found it, and I posted the picture, and it's just pixels, and it's just brighter. There's no hole. There's no nothing. He said, that's it. That's all they got. I'm done. I'm done with Big Bang Cosmos. Because what they're doing is they're pre-plugging. They're saying what I expect, and they have a whole series of equations. And if they get any brightness, then they say, oh, it worked. But they didn't actually see it.
No.
Right? I mean, there was a giant gas cloud that went right by the center of the Milky Way, didn't lose any gas. Now, they announced that it was going to pass by.
But if it was a black hole,
it should have sucked it off. But at the same time, it passes by. They make this huge announcement that our Milky Way, I remember this like 4 years ago, that our Milky Way black hole is going to feed, but it didn't lose any mass at all. They were totally perplexed, and they started coming up with reasons and funneling it out to the media. Right, it's not true.
It's not
because
true.
You can't divide by zero, folks.
Yeah,
you can't divide by zero. And if it's a singularity, there'd be only one mass. A black hole universe is a one-mass universe.
Yeah.
All right, and the radius has to be zero. When we were kids, it was a period, the size of a period at the end of the sentence. And now they got them various sizes. So it doesn't make any sense.
It's not consistent.
Right, the Schwarzschild radius is zero. So.
Let me check for any questions, and we're at the end.
We're going to be sliding in.
How about next time? When, where, and what are we going to?
Well, we're going to talk about Zep-Tepi. I guess then we can cover the end of astrology and the age of the gods. I've already done the Delaware quote. I think it's important that people know. I'm not here to tell you that Nibiru's coming and that it's going to strike the Earth with a lot of. If anything, it seems like we're in a more stable environment. Or it may be, we're more precarious. But the moon is going to do a good job. It's our watcher. It's going to protect a lot of things. I'm not that worried about
very intricately
the potential between the moon and the Earth is getting harder to reach critical potential every day because the moon is moving a little further away. I don't know how much charge it's storing from the sun versus how much we're storing. I know that the Earth is growing, and we'll have to go over that some other time. We're producing water. We are getting bigger. I don't know what that means, and I don't know if we can prove the seventh sun will end.
We'll find out.
Well, maybe, or we'll never know. But I wouldn't go forward with a lot of fear of these cataclysms. I do think they're fascinating.
They are.
Because the power we're talking about, that's one thing. Could this be used to to launch us to other moons and planets? I mean,
I think so.
Of course, I'm really worried about them trying to figure it out so they can use it as a weapon of war. But yeah, I know. I tell you, it's a hard thing. That might be where Velikovsky is most correct. I do think that there's a lot of indication, especially the way that the Library of Alexandria was burned down, like how we've behaved ever since Mars came against us in the third cataclysm, that we have something that we've got to get through. We spend a lot of money. We spend billions of dollars every year on end of the world movies and consumption of that material.
Yeah.
I think most people,
a lot of people are obsessed with it.
Right, they think the Age of Aquarius is going to be a total, like, wiping out, a conflagration, and then beginning anew. I don't know for sure. I think that we have to evolve, and Velikovsky said that we need to deal with what happened in the past, as if we were like abused children in a way. So we have to come to grips. It doesn't mean you have to, like, agree with everything in the Bible or start studying Egyptian and learn the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But where these things start to come together, you really see the electric universe start to make predictions, and making predictions about, say, the Nordic gods, or about the connection between Norse gods and the Greek gods, and then how that's correlated. That's useful information, and it's archaeologically useful. It may not help us to find it, but it may help us to understand what happened.
It's very interesting, all the correlations between the different
cultures. Cross correlation. I think that's the strong thing. Then they don't want. And remember that archaeologists, they only tend to study one. If they're a Mayanologist, they don't do the Egyptian stuff. And it's like Zahi Hawass. He didn't even know what Göbekli Tepe was.
Yeah.
And he gets cornered in the debate. Not even cornered, really. It was a question that somebody reasonably asked, and he flies off the handle about the question because he didn't know what Göbekli Tepe was.
Yeah.
Which is disappointing.
It is disappointing.
He's going to be the guy.
I bet he's learned what it is now.
Yeah, maybe. But he's going to be the guy interpreting the void. This is a guy who says he doesn't use radar.
Let's check for. Thanks for the hearts. There's no questions, and we are at the end of our show.
Sandra said something.
Same
accounts,
it's fascinating when the same accounts caught us apart, yet not untitled understanding.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a united understanding, Sandra. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. There's going to be more coming. Stay tuned. We have like another year of stuff that we can present to you. So bye for now. Bye. Kisses from Kentucky. If you guys think of any other questions that you have, stick them in the comments section, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.